The small desert town of Red Rock wasn't known for much. It was one of those places where everyone knew each other's business, and strangers stuck out like cactus needles in soft sand. So when she walked into the saloon that dusty afternoon, heads turned almost immediately. She wasn't flashy or loud, far from it, but there was something about her that made people curious. Her name was Clara Winters, though no one knew that yet. She wore a tattered coat that had seen better days, its fabric frayed at the edges and patched up in more than a few spots. Her boots were scuffed, their leather cracked from years of walking through rough terrain. But what caught everyone's attention most were the scars. A long, jagged burn mark ran along her left cheek, marring her otherwise calm features. Her hands bore smaller marks too, as if they'd been burned or cut repeatedly over time. Clara didn't speak much when she entered the saloon. She simply walked up to the barkeep, ordered water, not whiskey, and asked if anyone needed help with odd jobs around town. Her voice was quiet but steady, carrying just enough confidence to keep people from asking questions. The bartender, an older man named Gus, gave her a once-over before nodding toward the livery stable down the road. "Old Tom might need another pair of hands," he said gruffly. Clara nodded her thanks, dropped a coin on the counter, and left, without another word. Word spread quickly among the townsfolk. Who was this mysterious woman? Where did she come from? Why was she here? Some whispered that she might be running from trouble, while others thought she could be a bounty hunter looking for someone. No one really knew, and Clara didn't give them any answers. She kept to herself, working tirelessly at whatever job came her way. Whether it was mucking out stalls at the livery stable, hauling crates at the general store, or even fixing broken fences on nearby farms, Clara threw herself into her work with a determination that impressed even the hardest workers in Red Rock. Despite her efforts to blend in, Clara couldn't escape the stares and whispers. Children would peek at her from behind their mother's skirts, pointing at the scar on her face. Men eyed her warily, unsure whether to trust her. Women gossiped behind closed doors, speculating about her past. One rumor claimed she'd been part of a traveling circus until an accident left her disfigured. Another suggested she was a former outlaw trying to start fresh. None of these stories were true, but Clara didn't bother correcting anyone. Let them think what they wanted. She preferred it that way. At night, after a long day of work, Clara retreated to an old abandoned cabin on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, a single room with a leaky roof and walls thin enough to let in the howling wind, but it suited her just fine. She lit a small fire in the hearth to keep warm and ate simple meals of bread and jerky. There were no luxuries, no comforts, and certainly no company, just Clara and the silence of the desert. But even in solitude, Clara wasn't entirely alone. Memories haunted her, creeping in whenever she let her guard down. She often found herself staring into the flames, remembering the fire that had changed everything. It had happened years ago, back when her life was very different. Back then, she hadn't been Clara Wuthers, a drifter with nothing to her name. She'd been someone else entirely, living a life of privilege and wealth. But all of that was gone now, reduced to ashes just like the mansion where it had all begun. Clara shook her head, pulling herself back to the present. Thinking about the past only brought pain, and she couldn't afford to dwell on it. Not here. Not now. She had worked too hard to build this new life, fragile as it was, and she wouldn't let anything or anyone take it away from her. One day, while helping fix a fence on a nearby ranch, Clara met Jack Calloway. He was a cowboy in every sense of the word. Tall, broad-shouldered, with sun-kissed skin and calloused hands from years of hard labor. His hat was always tipped low, shading his piercing blue eyes, and his smile was easy, almost disarming. Jack owned a modest cattle ranch on the edge of town, and he was short-handed after one of his regular workers fell ill. Hearing about Clara's willingness to take on odd jobs, he hired her on the spot. At first, their interactions were purely professional. Jack gave instructions, and Clara followed them without question. But as they spent more time together riding, across the vast expanse of open land, Jack began to notice things about her. For one, She was incredibly skilled with her hands, able to mend fences faster than most men he'd worked with. She also had a sharp mind, offering practical solutions to problems that arose during their tasks. More importantly, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that demanded respect. Jack tried to engage her in conversation, asking about her background or why she ended up in Red Rock. Clara deflected his questions with polite but vague answers, never revealing too much. Still, Jack sensed there was more to her story than met the eye. Something about her demeanor hinted at a deep well of pain, hidden beneath layers of resilience. He admired her strength, but couldn't help feeling curious about the person behind the scars. As weeks passed, their relationship shifted subtly. They began sharing occasional jokes, lightening the mood during long hours of work. Once, when Clara slipped and nearly fell off a fence post, Jack reached out instinctively to steady her. She flinched at his touch but quickly regained her composure, muttering a quiet, "Thanks." Jack noticed the reaction but didn't press her about it. Instead, he made a mental note to be more mindful of her boundaries. By the time autumn rolled, around Clara had become a familiar presence on Jack's ranch. The other hands teased him good-naturedly, saying he'd finally found himself a partner who could match his work ethic. Jack laughed along with them, though privately, he knew it was more than that. Clara had started to fill a void in his life he hadn't realized existed. For the first time in years, he felt genuinely excited to wake up each morning, knowing she'd be there waiting to tackle the day's challenges alongside him. Yet despite the growing bond between them, Clara remained guarded. She rarely spoke about her past, and when she did, it was in carefully chosen words that revealed little. Jack respected her privacy, but couldn't shake the feeling that she was holding something back, something big. Whatever it was, he hoped, she'd trust him enough to share it someday. Until then, he was content to take things one day at a time, cherishing the moments they shared under the wide-open sky of Red Rock. Jack Calloway wasn't the kind of man who paid much attention to gossip. He had grown up in Red Rock, surrounded by its dusty streets and endless stretches of desert, and he knew how quickly rumors could spread like wildfire. So when people started whispering about Clara, about her scars, her mysterious past, and why she seemed so determined to keep to herself, Jack didn't join in. Instead, he focused on what he saw with his own eyes. What Jack saw was a woman who worked harder than anyone else. She didn't complain when the sun beat down mercilessly or when the wind whipped sand into her face. She didn't shy away from heavy lifting or dirty jobs, and she never asked for special treatment. In fact, if anything set Clara apart, it was her quiet determination. Where others might have given up or cut corners, she pushed through, doing every task with care and precision. It wasn't long before Jack realized that hiring her had been one of the best decisions he'd ever made. But there was more to Clara than her work ethic. As they spent more time together fixing fences, rounding up stray cattle, and tending to the ranch, Jack began to notice little things about her. For instance, she always carried a small knife tucked into her belt, not because she was looking for trouble, but because she liked being prepared. She moved with a grace that suggested she'd once lived a life far removed from the rugged simplicity of ranch work. And though she rarely smiled when she did, it lit up her entire face, softening the lines left by years of hardship. Jack found himself wanting to know more about her. On their rides across the open plains, he tried to draw her out with questions, starting with harmless topics like the weather or the ranch. Over time, he ventured further, asking about her family or where she'd learned to handle tools so skillfully. Clara's responses were always polite but guarded. She'd change the subject with a clever remark or steer the conversation back to safer ground. Still, Jack noticed that she seemed more at ease around him than she did with anyone else. That alone gave him hope. One afternoon, as they sat under the shade of a mesquite tree during a break, Jack decided to take a different approach. "You're not like most people who come through here," he said casually, leaning back against the trunk. "Most drifters don't stick around for long, but you—" He paused, glancing at her. "You seem like you're trying to build something. A new start, maybe?" Clara stiffened slightly. her hands resting on her knees. After a moment, she shrugged. Everyone's running from something, aren't they? Her tone was light, almost teasing, but Jack caught the flicker of sadness in her eyes. Maybe, he replied, studying her carefully. But not everyone runs as far as you have. She looked at him then, her gaze sharp and unreadable. For a second, Jack thought she might shut him down completely. Instead, she sighed softly and leaned forward, picking at a blade of grass. Running isn't always about escaping, she said after a while. Sometimes it's about finding a place where you can breathe again. Does that make sense? It did, though Jack couldn't quite put his finger on why. There was something deeply personal in her words, something raw and honest that resonated with him. He nodded slowly. Yeah, it makes sense. I guess we all need a place like that. They sat in silence for a while, watching the horizon shimmer in the heat. Jack wanted to ask more, to dig deeper into the story behind her cryptic words, but he held back. He sensed that pushing too hard would only drive her away. Instead, he let the moment pass, content to simply sit beside her and share the quiet. As the days turned into weeks, their bond grew stronger. Jack found himself looking forward to their time together, whether it was working side by side or sharing meals under the stars. He admired Clara's resilience and the way she carried herself with quiet dignity. At the same time, he felt protective of her, though he couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the way she flinched sometimes when touched unexpectedly, or the faint shadows that lingered in her eyes even when she smiled. Whatever it was, it made him want to shield her from the world, even as he respected her independence. Clara, for her part, was beginning to let her guard down, just a little. She still kept her secrets close, but she allowed herself to enjoy Jack's company. His easygoing nature and genuine kindness made her feel safe in a way she hadn't felt in years. When he cracked one of his corny jokes, she found herself laughing despite herself. And when he offered to teach her how to ride a particularly stubborn horse, she accepted without hesitation, trusting him implicitly. Their connection deepened one evening when a sudden storm rolled in, drenching them as they worked on a distant part of the ranch. They took shelter in an old barn, huddled together beneath a tarp to stay dry. The rain drummed steadily on the roof, filling the space with a soothing rhythm. Jack handed Clara a tin cup of coffee he'd brought along, and they sat cross-legged, on the hay-strewn floor talking about everything and nothing. You ever think about leaving this place? Jack asked suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. I mean, you've got skills, you could go anywhere, do anything. Clara sipped her coffee thoughtfully before answering. I've thought about it, she admitted. But places like this, they grow on you. The land, the sky, the people, it gets under your skin. Even if you try to leave, it pulls you back. Jack nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Red Rock might not have been perfect, but it was home. And now more than ever, he realized that Clara was becoming a part of that home for him. He glanced at her, taking in the way the dim light softened the edges of her scarred face. Well, I'm glad you stayed, he said quietly. This place is better with you here. Clara met his gaze, surprise flickering in her expression. Then slowly, a small smile curved her lips. Thanks, Jack, she murmured. That means a lot. The moment passed, but it lingered between them, unspoken yet undeniable. Jack felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the coffee or the closeness of the barn. For the first time in years, he felt truly alive, not just because of Clara's presence, but because she challenged him to be better, to care deeper. He knew he was falling for her, even if he couldn't say the words out loud yet. Still, as much as Jack appreciated Clara's strength and mystery, he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that she was hiding something significant. He didn't mind her secrets, at least not entirely, but he wondered how long she could keep running from whatever haunted her. One thing was certain. No matter what lay ahead, Jack was determined to stand by her side. Because even if he didn't know everything about her, he knew enough to realize that Clara Winters was worth fighting for. It was late one evening when Jack stumbled upon the clue that would change everything. He had been sorting through old ledgers and papers in the barn office, trying to organize receipts for tax season. The room was dimly lit by a single oil lamp, its flickering flame casting long shadows on the wooden walls. As he flipped through a stack of documents, something slipped out from between the pages and fluttered to the floor. Jack bent down to pick it up and froze. It was an old newspaper clipping, yellowed with age and brittle at the edges. At first glance, it seemed unremarkable, a black and white photo accompanied by a headline. But as his eyes scanned the words, his heart began to race. The headline read, "Heiress Missing After Family Estate Fire." Below it was a grainy photograph of a young woman standing in front of a sprawling mansion, her face partially obscured but unmistakably familiar. Jack's hands trembled as he stared at the image. The woman in the picture looked exactly like Clara. Same sharp cheekbones, same determined gaze, even the faint outline of what could be a scar along her left cheek. His mind raced with questions. Could this really be her? Was Clara not just a drifter but someone far more complicated than she'd let on? And if so, why had she kept it hidden? For a moment, Jack considered putting the clipping back where he'd found it and pretending he'd never seen it. But curiosity and concern got the better of him. If Clara was keeping such a big secret, there had to be a reason. Maybe she needed help, or maybe she was in danger. Either way, Jack knew he couldn't ignore it. The next morning, after breakfast, Jack waited until they were alone in the barn before bringing up the topic. He pulled the clipping from his pocket and held it out to Clara, his expression serious. "Clara," he said gently, "I need you to explain this." Clara froze, her hand hovering midway to the pitchfork she'd been reaching for. For a split second, her face went pale, and then her shoulders sagged as if all the fight had drained out of her. She didn't take the clipping right away. Instead, she stared at it, her jaw tightening. Finally, she reached out and took it, her fingers brushing against Jack's briefly before pulling back. "I wondered how long it would take for someone to find this," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. She turned the clipping over in her hands, studying it as if seeing it for the first time in years. Then, without looking at Jack, she sighed and leaned against the barn wall. "You deserve the truth," she admitted. "But I don't know if you're ready for it." Jack stepped closer, his heart pounding. "Try me," he urged. "Whatever it is, I'm here." Clara hesitated, her eyes distant as though she were reliving memories she'd rather forget. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but tinged with pain. "My name isn't Clara Winters," she began. "At least not originally. My real name is Clara Hartman. I used to live in Texas, in that house you saw in the picture." She gestured toward the clipping still clutched in her hand. "That mansion was my family's estate. We were rich. Very rich." Jack listened intently, his brow furrowed. This wasn't what he'd expected. "What happened?" he asked softly. Clara swallowed hard, her gaze dropping to the floor. "A fire," she said simply. "One night the house burned down. Everyone thought it was an accident at first, but..." Her voice trailed off and she shook her head. "It wasn't. Someone set it deliberately. My parents died in the blaze and I barely escaped with my life." She touched the scar on her cheek absently, as if remembering the heat of the flames. Jack felt a chill run down his spine. "Who did it?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. "I don't know for certain," Clara replied, "but I have my suspicions. There were people close to my family who stood to gain from our deaths, business partners, lawyers, even relatives. After the fire, I disappeared. I couldn't trust anyone anymore, not even the police. So I ran, changed my name, cut ties with everyone I knew, and started over. That's how I ended up here." Jack processed this revelation in silence, his mind reeling. It explained so much. The scars, the secrecy, the way she flinched at sudden movements. But it also raised new questions. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he asked finally. "You must have known I wouldn't judge you." Clara gave him a sad smile. "It's not about judgment," she said. "It's about survival. Out here in Red Rock, I'm just Clara. No one cares about my money or my past. Here, I can breathe. If I told you or anyone, you'd start treating me differently. People see wealth before they see a person. I didn't want that. Jack nodded slowly, understanding her reasoning even if it hurt to hear. But what about now? He pressed. Why stay hidden? You're safe here. You don't have to keep running. Clara looked at him then, her eyes searching his face. Do you think it's that simple? She asked. Even if I stop running, the past doesn't disappear. Money has a way of following you, Jack. And with it comes trouble. As if on cue, the sound of hoofbeats echoed outside the barn. Both Jack and Clara turned toward the door, startled. A moment later, a man rode into view, his polished boots and tailored suit marking him as someone who didn't belong in Red Rock. He dismounted smoothly and strode toward them, tipping his hat with a practiced smile. Miss Hartman, he said, his voice smooth and confident. Or should I say Miss Winters? It's been quite the challenge tracking you down. Clara stiffened, her hand instinctively moving to the knife tucked into her belt. Who are you? She demanded, her tone icy. The man chuckled, unfazed by her hostility. Victor Lang, at your service, he replied. I represent the remnants of the Hartman estate. Your inheritance includes thousands of acres of valuable land across Texas, Miss Hartman. Developers are eager to buy, and I'm here to ensure you sign the necessary paperwork. Jack stepped forward protectively, positioning himself between Clara and Victor. She doesn't want anything to do with you, he growled. Leave her alone. Victor raised an eyebrow, his smile never faltering. Now, cowboy, he said mockingly. This is a matter of business, not personal vendettas. Miss Hartman stands to make a fortune, a percentage of which will go to me, naturally, if she cooperates. Surely that's worth considering. Clara's grip tightened on her knife, but she forced herself to remain calm. I already told you, she said coldly. I don't care about the money. Take your offer and leave. Victor's smile faded slightly, replaced by a hint of irritation. Be reasonable, Clara, he said, dropping the pretense of politeness. You can't hide forever. Sign the papers and we'll call it even. Refuse, and things might get complicated. With that, he tipped his hat again and mounted his horse, riding off as casually as he'd arrived. Jack watched him go, his fists clenched in anger. When he turned back to Clara, she was pale but resolute. He's bluffing, she said firmly, though her voice betrayed a hint of fear. Victor's greedy, but he's not dangerous. Not yet. Jack shook his head. We can't take chances, he insisted. If he knows where you are, others will too. We need to figure out what he's really after, and fast. Clara nodded, grateful for his support but dreading what lay ahead. For years she had managed to outrun her past, building a new life in Red Rock. But now it seemed her secrets had caught up with her, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a much larger storm. The days that followed Victor Lang's arrival in Red Rock were tense and uneasy. Clara couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, no matter how hard she tried to convince herself otherwise. Every creak of the floorboards in her cabin at night made her heart race. Shadows cast by the moonlight seemed darker, longer and more menacing than usual. Even during the day when she worked alongside Jack on the ranch, she found herself glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see unfamiliar faces lurking nearby. Victor hadn't returned yet, but his presence lingered like a storm cloud waiting to break. Clara knew he wasn't bluffing about the complications he'd hinted at. Men like him didn't operate alone. They had networks of contacts, informants, and enforcers who could make life difficult for anyone who stood in their way. And while Victor might have been polished and polite on the surface, Clara understood that beneath his charm lay something far more dangerous. Greed. Jack noticed the change in her almost immediately. She became quieter, more withdrawn, as if carrying a weight too heavy for words. Her movements, once confident and deliberate, now carried an edge of nervousness. He tried to reassure her, reminding her that she wasn't alone anymore. Whatever happens, he told her one evening as they sat together under the stars, we'll face it together. You don't have to carry this burden by yourself. Clara appreciated his kindness, but struggled to fully believe him. After years of running, trusting others felt foreign and terrifying. Still, there was something about Jack's unwavering support that gave her strength. Maybe, just maybe, she could fight back instead of fleeing again. Determined not to let fear dictate her actions, Clara decided to dig deeper into Victor's claims. If he thought she would roll over and sign away her inheritance without question, he was sorely mistaken. The Hartman estate wasn't just land or money, it was her family's legacy, tainted though it may have been. She owed it to herself and to the memory of her parents to uncover the truth. With Jack's help, Clara began combing through old records stored in the town's tiny library. It wasn't much, a single room filled with dusty books and crumbling newspapers, but it was enough to start piecing together fragments of her past. They pored over legal documents, property deeds, and archived news articles about the fire that destroyed her childhood home. Slowly, a pattern emerged. Victor Lang wasn't just some random lawyer sent to negotiate a deal. His name appeared repeatedly in connection with shady real estate transactions tied to the Hartman estate. In fact, several lawsuits had been filed against him over the years, accusing him of fraudulent practices and illegal land grabs. None of the cases had stuck, however, thanks to clever legal maneuvering and well-placed bribes. Clara's suspicions deepened when they discovered evidence linking Victor to the very people she suspected of orchestrating the fire all those years. Ago. One name stood out in particular: Charles Hargrove, a former business partner of her father's who had mysteriously vanished shortly after the tragedy. According to old court filings, Hargrove had been embroiled in a bitter dispute with the Hartmans over mineral rights to their vast tracts of land. When the fire occurred, conveniently wiping out the entire family, Hargrove resurfaced and promptly sold off large portions of the Hartman estate to developers. It didn't take long for Clara to connect the dots. Victor wasn't here to help her reclaim her rightful inheritance. He was here to finish what Hargrove and his associates had started. By pressuring her to sign over control of the remaining land, they hoped to erase any chance of her exposing the truth behind the fire. But Clara refused to play their game. Armed with the evidence they'd uncovered, Clara and Jack devised a plan to expose Victor's schemes. First, they needed proof strong enough to hold up in court, something concrete that tied him directly to the fraud and corruption surrounding the Hartman estate. Then they would present their findings to the authorities, ensuring that Victor's crimes came to light. But gathering that proof wouldn't be easy. Victor was careful, operating through intermediaries and shell companies designed to obscure his involvement. To catch him, Clara and Jack would need to infiltrate his network, a risky move that could put them both in danger. One evening, as they discussed their next steps in the safety of Jack's kitchen, Clara voiced her concerns. "This isn't just about me anymore," she said, her voice tinged with guilt. "If we go after Victor, he'll retaliate. I can't risk dragging you or anyone else in Red Rock into this mess." Jack set down the cup of coffee he'd been holding and looked at her squarely. "You're already part of my life, Clara," he said firmly. "And whether you like it or not, your fight is mine too. Besides, I'm not letting you face this alone." His words brought tears to her eyes, though she quickly blinked them away. For so long, she'd carried the weight of her past by herself, convinced that relying on others would only lead to betrayal. But Jack's loyalty reminded her that some battles weren't meant to be fought alone. The next morning, Clara and Jack paid a visit to Gus, the bartender at the saloon. Though gruff and reserved, Gus had lived in Red Rock for decades and knew everyone who passed through town. More importantly, he had connections, friends in neighboring towns who might be able to provide additional information about Victor's dealings. Gus listened intently as Clara explained the situation, his expression growing darker with each detail. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and sighed heavily. "I've seen men like Victor before," he said grimly. "They think they're untouchable because they wear fancy suits and talk big. But every empire has cracks, and if you know where to look, you can bring it crashing down." He promised to reach out to his contacts and see what he could uncover. In the meantime, he warned Clara and Jack to stay vigilant. Men like Victor don't take kindly to threats, he said. If he finds out you're onto him, things could get ugly real fast. True to his word, Gus delivered valuable intel within days. One of his friends in a nearby town had heard rumors about Victor meeting secretly with two rough-looking characters known for their work as hired muscle. Their presence confirmed Clara's worst fears. Victor wasn't just planning to intimidate her, he was preparing to eliminate her entirely. Faced with this new threat, Clara and Jack realized they had no choice but to act quickly. Using the evidence they'd gathered, they drafted a detailed report outlining Victor's fraudulent activities and sent anonymous copies to local law enforcement agencies. At the same time, they leaked key pieces of information to a trustworthy journalist in a larger city, hoping to generate public pressure that would force officials to investigate further. It was a risky strategy. One wrong move could expose them, but Clara was done running. She had spent years hiding from her past, allowing fear to dictate her choices. Now with Jack by her side, she was ready to confront the truth head-on, no matter the cost. As they prepared for the final stage of their plan, Clara allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. Standing outside Jack's ranch house, she gazed out at the horizon, bathed in the golden light of sunset. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of peace, not because the danger had passed, but because she finally understood what it meant to stand her ground. Whatever happened next, she knew she wouldn't face it alone, and that, more than anything, gave her hope. Clara knew the stakes were higher than ever. Victor Lang wasn't just a slick-talking lawyer with questionable ethics. He was a predator, and she could feel his net tightening around her. Every moment spent in Red Rock felt like borrowed time, and Clara couldn't shake the idea that staying put might put Jack and the entire town in harm's way. For all her newfound resolve to stand her ground, the thought of endangering someone she cared about gnawed at her relentlessly. One night, after another long day of strategizing and gathering evidence, Clara sat alone in the cabin she'd called home for months. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, casting flickering shadows on the walls. She stared into the flames, her mind racing with possibilities. If Victor found out what she and Jack were planning, there was no telling how far. He'd go to stop them. He'd already hinted at complications, and Clara had no doubt those complications would involve threats, or worse. Her hands trembled slightly as she packed her few belongings into a worn leather satchel. A change of clothes, some dried, food, and the knife she always carried, enough to get by until she could disappear again. She told herself it was the right thing to do. By leaving, she could draw Victor away from Red Rock, away from Jack. It wasn't fair to ask him to risk everything for her sake. He deserved better, a life free from danger and uncertainty. But as she stood by the door, ready to slip out under the cover of darkness, a voice stopped her cold. "Where are you going?" Jack stood in the doorway, silhouetted by the moonlight. His hat was tilted low, but his piercing blue eyes caught hers immediately. Clara froze, her heart pounding. She hadn't heard him approach, and guilt flooded through her. How could she explain this without sounding selfish or cowardly? I can't stay here anymore," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "If I leave, Victor will follow me. That'll give you and everyone else a chance to move on." Jack stepped inside, closing the door behind him. His expression was calm but firm. "Running won't solve this," he said evenly. "You're stronger than you think, Clara. And you're not alone anymore." His words cut through her defenses like nothing else could. Clara turned away, trying to hide the tears welling up in her eyes. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice breaking. "This isn't your fight. I've already lost too much. I can't lose you too." Jack crossed the room in 2 strides and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "You're not going to lose me," he said firmly. "Not unless you push me away yourself. But if you leave now, that's exactly what you'll be doing. You'll be running again, letting fear win. Is that really what you want?" Clara shook her head, though she didn't trust herself to speak. Fear had been her constant companion for so long that imagining a life without it felt impossible. Yet, standing there with Jack's steady presence beside her, she began to wonder if maybe, Just maybe, she didn't have to face everything alone. Victor isn't invincible, Jack continued. We've got proof of his schemes and we've sent it to people who can help. Running now would only make things worse. It would tell him we're afraid, and that's exactly what he wants. Clara took a deep breath, forcing herself to meet his gaze. There was no judgment in his eyes, only unwavering support. Slowly she nodded. Okay, she said quietly. We'll do it your way. Together. The next morning, Clara and Jack finalized their plan. They decided to confront Victor directly, using the evidence they'd gathered to force his hand. If they could catch him off guard, they might be able to expose his crimes before he had a chance to retaliate. It was a risky move, but they had no other choice. That afternoon, they rode into town, heading straight for the saloon where Victor had last been seen. Gus, the bartender, tipped them off that Victor was meeting with the two hired men Clara had heard about earlier. Armed with copies of the documents tying Victor to fraudulent land deals, Clara and Jack entered the saloon cautiously. Victor was seated at a corner table, his polished boots propped up on a chair. The two rough-looking men flanked him, their eyes scanning the room suspiciously. When Clara and Jack approached, Victor's smile faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered. Well, well, he said smoothly, leaning back in his chair. Miss Hartman, to what do I owe the pleasure? Clara didn't waste time with pleasantries. She slid a folder across the table, its contents spilling out onto the surface. These documents prove you've been stealing from my family's estate for years, she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. If you don't leave Red Rock and drop this ridiculous scheme, you'll regret it. Victor's smile vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating glare. He glanced at the papers, then back at Clara. You think a few scraps of paper scare me? He sneered. Even if they're real, no one will believe you over me. I've built my reputation carefully, Miss Hartman. You're just a ghost from the past. Before Clara could respond, one of the hired men lunged forward, grabbing her arm roughly. Jack reacted instantly, stepping between them and shoving the man back. Touch her again, and you'll regret it, he growled, his fists clenched. Tension crackled in the air as the standoff escalated. But before anyone could throw a punch, Gus appeared from behind the bar, holding a shotgun. Enough, he barked, leveling the weapon at Victor and his thugs. This is my town, and I won't have troublemakers causing problems. Take your business elsewhere, or deal with the consequences. For a moment, no one moved. Then, with a curt nod, Victor stood up, signaling for his men to follow him. As they exited the saloon, he shot Clara one last venomous look. This isn't over, he spat before disappearing into the street. Clara exhaled sharply, her knees nearly buckling with relief. Jack steadied her, his grip firm but reassuring. Are you okay? He asked softly. She nodded, though her hands were still trembling. Thank you, she whispered, for everything. Later that evening, as word spread about what had happened, in the saloon, the townsfolk rallied around Clara and Jack. Gus shared the evidence with local law enforcement while others kept watch for any signs of Victor returning. Within days, news of Victor's illegal activities reached the authorities in neighboring counties, prompting an official investigation. As the dust settled, Clara realized something profound. She wasn't fighting alone anymore. For the first time in years, she had allies, people who believed in her and supported her unconditionally. And among them, Jack stood out as her rock, her partner in every sense of the word. One evening, as they watched the sunset together, Clara turned to Jack and smiled. I never thought I'd say this, she admitted, but I think I'm finally ready to stop running. Whatever happens next, I know I can handle it, with you by my side. Jack grinned, tipping his hat back. Good, he said, because I'm not going anywhere. They sat in comfortable silence, the weight of the past lifting ever so slightly. Though challenges undoubtedly lay ahead, Clara felt a renewed sense of hope. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a future, not as a scarred, Drifter haunted by ghosts, but as a woman reborn surrounded by love and purpose. And Jack? He was simply grateful to be part of her journey. Months passed, and life in Red Rock began to settle into a rhythm that felt almost normal. The storm of threats and danger stirred up by Victor Lang had blown over, leaving behind a sense of relief and renewal. With the evidence Clara and Jack had gathered, local authorities launched a full-scale investigation into Victor's activities. It didn't take long for his web of corruption to unravel. Developers who had worked with him were subpoenaed, shell companies were exposed, and arrests followed one after another. Victor himself disappeared shortly after the confrontation at the saloon, but whispers suggested he'd fled to parts unknown, too afraid to face justice. For Clara, the aftermath was both liberating and surreal. She no longer had to live in fear of being hunted or manipulated. The Hartman estate, once a source of pain and betrayal, now belonged entirely to her. Thousands of acres of valuable land stretched across Texas, untouched by developers thanks to her years of anonymity. But instead of hoarding her inheritance or retreating back into isolation, Clara made a decision that surprised even herself. She would use it to rebuild, not just her own life, but the lives of those around her. One crisp autumn morning, Clara stood on a hill overlooking the Callaway Ranch, which had grown significantly in recent months. Jack had insisted on investing part of her wealth into expanding the ranch, hiring more hands and upgrading equipment to make it more efficient. Together, they had turned what was once a modest operation into a thriving enterprise. Cattle grazed peacefully in newly fenced pastures, and fresh paint gleamed on the barn doors. The sight filled Clara with pride, not because of the money involved, but because of what it represented. A future built on trust, hard work, and partnership. Jack joined her on the hill, tipping his hat against the bright sunlight. "Looks good, doesn't it?" he said with a grin, gesturing toward the sprawling property below. Clara nodded, her lips curving into a soft smile. "Better than I ever imagined," she admitted. "When I first came here, all I wanted was to disappear. Now..." She paused, searching for the right words. "Now I feel like I've found something worth staying for." Jack chuckled, nudging her lightly with his elbow. "You mean me, right?" She rolled her eyes playfully but couldn't hide the warmth in her expression. "Don't let it go to your head, Cowboy." Their banter carried an ease that hadn't been there when they first met. Back then, Clara had been guarded, wary of letting anyone get too close. Jack, for his part, had been patient, respecting her boundaries while gently chipping away at the walls she'd built around herself. Over time, those walls had crumbled, replaced by a bond neither of them could have anticipated. They weren't just partners in work. They were partners in every sense of the word. But Clara's transformation extended beyond her relationship with Jack. She had also become a vital part of the Red Rock community. The townsfolk, who had once whispered about her scars and speculated about her past, now greeted her warmly whenever she walked down the main street. Children ran up to her, asking if she'd teach them how to mend fences or ride horses. Shopkeepers tipped their hats in respect, knowing she had played a key role in revitalizing the town's economy. Even Gus, the gruff bartender, had started calling her kid with a fondness that belied his usual tough exterior. Clara's generosity wasn't limited to Red Rock. Using funds from the Hartman estate, she established scholarships for local students hoping to attend college, funded repairs for the town's crumbling infrastructure, and donated land to families struggling to make ends meet. Her actions spoke louder than any words ever could. She wasn't the same woman who had arrived in Red Rock as a scarred drifter. She was someone new, someone stronger, braver, and deeply connected to the people around her. Still, Clara knew her journey wasn't without its challenges. There were moments when old fears crept back in, reminding her of the fire that had taken so much from her. Sometimes late at night she woke up sweating, haunted by memories she thought she'd buried. On those nights, Jack was always there, holding her hand and whispering reassurances until the darkness receded. He never pushed her to talk unless she wanted to, but his presence alone was enough to remind her that she wasn't alone anymore. As winter approached, Bringing with it frosty mornings and clear, star-filled skies, Clara decided to visit the ruins of her family's estate in Texas. It was a trip she'd avoided for years, dreading the emotions it might stir. But now, standing on solid ground, with Jack by her side, she felt ready to confront the ghost of her past. The mansion was little more than a skeleton now, its charred remains overtaken by weeds and vines. Clara walked slowly through the rubble, her boots crunching on broken glass and ash. Memories flooded back, the laughter of her parents, the smell of her mother's cooking, the sound of her father's voice echoing through the halls. Tears streamed down her face as she knelt beside a cracked marble fireplace, tracing the engraving of the Hartman family crest with trembling fingers. Jack stayed a few steps behind, giving her space to process everything. When she finally stood up, wiping her cheeks with the back of her hand, he stepped forward and placed a comforting arm around her shoulders. "You okay?" he asked softly. Clara nodded, taking a deep breath. "I think so," she replied. "It's strange. I thought coming here would hurt more, but instead, it feels peaceful, like I'm saying goodbye for real this time." They spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the grounds, imagining what the estate must have looked like in its prime. By the time they left, the sun was setting, painting the horizon in hues of orange and pink. As they drove away, Clara glanced back at the ruins one last time. Then, with a small smile, she turned her attention to the road ahead. Back in Red Rock, life continued to flourish. Clara and Jack celebrated Christmas with the townsfolk, hosting a massive feast at the ranch that brought everyone together. For the first time in years, Clara allowed herself to truly enjoy the holiday season, laughing alongside friends and savoring the simple joys of community. She even exchanged gifts with Jack, a silver locket engraved with the date they'd met, a reminder of how far they'd come since that day. By spring, plans were underway for a new chapter in their lives. Clara had decided to build a home on the hill overlooking the ranch, a place where she and Jack could start fresh while remaining close to the land and people they loved. Construction began in earnest, with the entire town pitching in to help. Neighbors brought food for the workers, children delivered flowers to brighten the site, and Gus even volunteered to supervise the project, ensuring everything was done right. On the day the house was completed, Clara stood on the porch, looking out at the breathtaking view of the ranch and the desert beyond. Jack joined her, slipping an arm around her waist. "What do you think?" he asked, his tone teasing but warm. "It's perfect," Clara said, leaning into him. "More than I ever dreamed of." As they stood there, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Clara realized something profound. She wasn't defined by the scars on her face or the tragedies of her past. Those things were part of her story, yes, but they didn't dictate her future. What mattered most was the love she shared, the connections she forged, and the hope she carried within her. And as long as Jack was by her side, Clara knew she could face anything the world threw her way. Together they had turned a dusty corner of Red Rock into a home, a testament to resilience, courage, and the power of second chances.